Hi everyone, is it possible for a human being to live forever without aging? It might sound like a question for ancient alchemists pursuing an elixir of life, but within our cells, the science of epigenetics may have found an answer in our very genes, and that answer is probably. Keep watching to learn more about this miraculous discovery. This video has 3 parts. What is aging? Overview of epigenetics, and reversing the epigenetic clock. Part 1. What is aging? Growing old can seem like such a natural part of our world that it can be hard to think about it objectively, but one way of looking at it, favored by longevity researchers, is that aging is an illness that affects everybody. An illness in the sense that your body is no longer working the way it should. Many people have wondered throughout the ages if aging is a condition that can be cured, or at least slowed. There's some reason to think that this might be possible because different people age at different rates. And it's a natural, selfish instinct for anybody who's alive, really, to want that state to continue as long as possible. One thing people always bring up when you talk about immortality is what would happen to all the young people. If no one's actually dying, then those young people don't have any place to fill. Interestingly, though, the demographics of advanced societies are already such that we're below the birth replacement rate. In other words, the population shrinks over time because fewer and fewer babies are being born. It's especially advanced in countries like Japan and China, but almost all advanced nations are suffering from this. They're just replacing people through immigration. So from a purely practical standpoint, it might actually work out in the long run if people are having fewer babies, but then people are also living longer. There are tons of philosophical questions when it comes to immortality or even just expanding human lifespans, and I can talk about those in a different video. In this video, we're going to focus on one path to immortality. I can think of at least 3, so let's go into them briefly. The simplest is the fully digital approach. If we can simulate an entire human body or an entire human brain, we might be able to perform a brain scan and then upload people to the cloud. Another path would be to leverage technology to augment our physical bodies. For example, leveraging medical nanobots that are just always present in your bloodstream to help optimize your body's processes and maybe fight pathogens for you, taking on some functions of your immune system. And finally, we have the fully biological approach of leveraging the science of epigenetics to perform anti-aging treatments. The last one, of course, is what we're going to focus on in this video, but please let me know in the comments if you'd like to see one of these other 2 approaches or a more philosophical video in the future. The process of aging causes many different side effects in a human body. One of the most well-known is that the telomere length of cells keeps decreasing. Telomeres are basically the ends of DNA strands, and every time a strand of DNA is copied, the telomere gets slightly shorter. If you do this enough times, then eventually you start removing actual useful information from that DNA, causing the cells to not really replicate properly. However, this doesn't explain aging entirely on its own because there are a number of very long-lived cells in our bodies, including neurons and stem cells. And if you don't have cell replication through division going on, telomere lengths are unaffected. The second side effect you might have heard of is what's called free radical damage. When your body is exposed to radiation from the sun, for example, that can cause some molecules to break off and just start drifting. And because of their charge, they can become attracted to other molecules in your body, causing undesirable side effects over time. And one of the simple ways to avoid this is to eat more antioxidant foods. So sometimes you see that being advertised. Blueberries are my favorite antioxidant food. Another process that happens in your body as you age is that biological processes end up in less stable states where they're not operating as optimally as when you were younger. This is fairly natural for a chaotic system over time, even one that's self-correcting. And one of the examples of this that we'll talk about in this video is your thymus, which is an organ that is significantly affected by aging. And finally, number 4 in this list is epigenetic damage. Basically what this means is that cells lose some information about how they're supposed to be operating, and they might start acting as different cells or start reading completely incorrect information from the DNA. That can cause cells to go haywire or just not function properly, or even start acting against the best interests of your body, as in cancer. We'll talk a bit about these different side effects throughout the video, so keep them in mind. Despite all this, it's quite possible for an organism to live for a very long time. My favorite example are sequoias and redwood trees, which grow in California and can live for thousands of years. The oldest living sequoia that we know of, for example, is about 3,200 years old. Sequoias date back to the time of the dinosaurs. I think it was the Jurassic period when they covered almost all of North America at the time. And their evolutionary strategy is literally to live for centuries. So all of these problems associated with aging are also affecting sequoias. So how are we different from sequoias? One theory proposed by Peter Medawar is that simpler organisms often have an advantage when it comes to selecting certain genetic mutations. A tree, for example, puts out new seeds every year. So if the tree develops a beneficial genetic mutation during its lifespan, then it will have some seeds that are going to propagate that to future generations. But if you take humans, for example, humans are generally reproducing when they're fairly young. So if you develop a genetic mutation that's really beneficial later in life, that may not make it to the next generation. And furthermore, if there's a negative genetic mutation that actually makes you die young, you may still have had children and successfully pass that along. Keep in mind that as recently as 1850, the average human lifespan was 40 years. So if there was some negative genetic mutation that was causing everybody who had it to get cancer at the age of 60, then that mutation wasn't being removed from the gene pool. Anybody that actually had that mutation would have had their kids well before the age of 60, and if everybody's only living to age 40 anyway, it simply never manifests. More complicated organisms like vertebrates that are moving around also have to go through far more cell generations. We consume a lot more energy, we have a lot more cell division going on, and that's going to accelerate a lot of these processes that lead to aging. The way I think about it is that a vertebrate, or a human let's say, has a body that is a self-regulating system that's in a delicate balance. If your body gets too hot, it tries to cool itself down. If you end up running every day out of breath, your body tries to strengthen your leg muscles. If a virus starts invading your lungs, your body tries to fight it off. It's fully self-regulating, regardless of all the strange things that might be thrown at you out on the African savanna before we had civilization. Also, the building blocks of a human body are cells, and cells are not entirely trustworthy entities. I mean, each cell is given all of your DNA and told, go become that cell type, but a cell is a living thing. It can, in theory, replicate beyond its instructions and operate on its own and take different actions depending on the environment it finds itself in. It's like building a computer out of a lot of different microchips that all have a small chance to randomly stop working or become sentient, and all you're trying to do is keep the computer running and it's not self-destructing. A remarkably apt analogy when we start thinking about AI these days. So anyway, evolution is fighting against entropy and destabilization of the delicate system that makes up a living being. Part 2, Overview of Epigenetics. Let's start by talking about DNA. You're almost certainly familiar with the double helix that forms DNA, maybe with the 4 strange letters that form the bases that are inside DNA. To be honest, I didn't know too much about DNA until recently, but I did get a chance to visit Cambridge University, where Crick and Watson, along with Rosalind, actually ran the experiments and put together the evidence that DNA existed. There's a bar where Crick and Watson used to go to, and they have a plaque outside the door that talks about how Crick and Watson went there and announced their discovery of DNA, and someone nicely scratched in Rosalind's name underneath. Rosalind, of course, gathered a lot of the data for these 2 men, and even died young because of exposure to radiation or something. But finally, she's starting to get a lot of the credit that she deserves. Anyways, so DNA encodes a sequence of genes. In humans, there are about 100,000 genes encoded within DNA. Genes are bits of information that cells can use in different contexts. You can think about DNA as a bit like a hard drive, where the genes are the files on the hard drive. You can access any of the files at any time and put together some combination, and in the case of DNA, that combination tells the cell what it should be doing. And that's how you get all the complexities that form a human body arising out of just one cell. Not all 100,000 genes are actually used. There's actually tons of junk there in the DNA because it evolved randomly. Genes can either be expressed or not expressed. That's how come a person can be a carrier for a certain gene that leads to disease or that leads to different eye color or whatever, but not actually have that characteristic themselves. The gene is simply not expressed in that person. So each cell in the human body has DNA inside it, and actually every cell has exactly the same DNA inside it in theory. When a cell splits and the DNA replicates, the 2 parts of the double helix start splitting, and then they start getting reformed with another pair, so you end up with 2 copies of the same thing eventually. Of course, DNA tries to replicate as faithfully as possible, but mutations do occur, where there's an error during the copying process and you end up with slightly different DNA in the new cell than you did in the original. And this, of course, is the basis for evolution. So now we can talk about epigenetics. As I mentioned, DNA is a static encoding of information, and every cell has exactly the same DNA. This represents a problem because not every cell in the human body is identical. In fact, there are 200 different types of cells just in a human body. So the epigenome is the name for a couple of different structures that exist on top of DNA. It's basically like chemical markers that say this gene should be used or this gene was already used, or maybe disabling certain portions of the DNA of the genome. And collectively, those structures say you are a cell of type X, and here's the portion of DNA that you should concern yourself with. Here are the genes, in other words, that have already been expressed or that have been inhibited or that have already been used. So the epigenome is like an instantiation of the DNA customized for a particular cell. If DNA mutates, then every cell that's split off of that mutated cell will have the exact same mutation because the information in DNA is carried along. However, if the epigenome mutates, then that one cell will lose its cohesion and purpose. It might just sit there, it might start acting as a different type of cell. It basically has been programmed to do the wrong thing at that point. This is really at the core of aging. Some of the cells end up with an epigenome that has been corrupted, so the cell simply doesn't do its job anymore. It might even become a cancer cell and start replicating and acting against the interest of your own body, the rest of which is coordinated by DNA and then the correct epigenome on top that is exposing the correct genes to each cell no matter where it is in your body. There's a term DNA methylation, which is the term for an epigenetic configuration population that has mutated. You can basically look at all of the different structures and chemicals and tags that are attached to a DNA sequence, put them into an AI model, and that AI model will look at that different methylation and predict the age of the cell. This is called the epigenetic clock because it's a very accurate measure of the age of a cell. Essentially, DNA methylation is like the accumulation of entropy within an analog system, which is the cell. Of course, this is generally a bad thing because it means that the cell might eventually start expressing different genes and going off the rails. David Sinclair calls this the information theory of aging. And it's surprisingly apt because epigenetics is basically software, right? It's just configuration. Every cell gets given the same sequence of DNA, and then the epigenome on top is just software that tells it how it should use this resource it's been given. And like software, you can throw away the epigenome and recreate it if you really need to. And this actually does happen. There's a creature called the immortal jellyfish, which can, in theory, live forever. This creature comes in two forms. It can be a polyp, which is basically a type of coral attached to a reef and immobile, and it can also be in this adult jellyfish form where it is mobile. The really interesting part is that a single organism can go from this immature phase to the adult form and back again. In fact, it can do that repeatedly throughout its life. And the way this works is through a mechanism called transdifferentiation. It's the only known living organism that actually performs transdifferentiation, which basically means that the cells completely throw away their software, they throw away their epigenome, and then they adopt a new one. So the cells have the same DNA, but they decide, okay, I'm not going to be an adult cell anymore. I'm going to go back to being an immature child cell. And again, this happens without any cell division at all. It's the exact same cell that just gets reprogrammed to do something differently. You can see, I hope, how this is very interesting for the aging discussion. One of the main side effects of cells getting older is that they incur epigenetic damage, or DNA methylation. Lots of entropy, lots of analog wear and tear, to the point where the cell no longer knows what it's supposed to be doing. However, you can, at any moment, wipe away the entire epigenome and put it back again, or put back whatever is supposed to be there, whatever that cell is supposed to be doing. No cell division needed, just a little bit of reprogramming. The way I think about it is that we are Darwinian machines that are capable of self-healing, learning, and even neuroplasticity, so changes inside our brain, and we're still just figuring out the programming language used in these machines. Part 3. Reversing the epigenetic clock. A Japanese scientist named Shinya Yamanaka won a Nobel Prize in 2012 for basically cracking the code for how to do epigenetic reprogramming in humans. You could take an adult skin cell from a human, express those 6 genes, and that would turn it into a so-called pluripotent stem cell, which is basically the jack-of-all-trades cell, because it can be turned into any other type of cell, any other type of tissue. So you can start with ordinary skin cells, go to this jack-of-all-trades cell, and then grow any other tissue that you like, including, say, all the pieces necessary to regrow an entire arm. If the term stem cell sounds familiar, it's probably because there are stem cells inside our bone marrow, and sometimes when you undergo chemotherapy or in other situations, those stem cells die, and then you can't start from those stem cells and create a myriad of other cells inside your body, which is really serious. So they might do a stem cell transplant from a different person or from a different part of your body to replace those jack-of-all-trades cells. So this is very exciting, right? And I'm going to talk now about David Sinclair, who's a researcher and also has a lot up on YouTube, so you can check out some of his videos. And David Sinclair's group did some research which ended up on the cover of Nature in December 2020, and the title was Turning Back Time. They were doing some experiments on mice, and the most astonishing experiment had a mouse which ended up blind, and then they triggered 3 of these Yamanaka genes, which basically turned back the clock for all of the cells inside the optic nerve for that mouse. And the optic nerve basically grew back completely, which can happen with young nerves but does not happen with adult nerve cells. So the mouse went from completely blind to being able to see again. And then they did something again which caused the mouse to become blind a second time, perhaps just letting it live for a long time. I think that mice might get blind when they get older. And they did it a second time. They were able to trigger those 3 Yamanaka genes again and then get the optic nerve to repair itself for a second time. And the mouse went from being blind again to being able to see again, which is simply astonishing. I watched a number of videos by David Sinclair, and there are many other examples like this. I won't really go through any of it in more detail here, but I do encourage you to check out some of his videos, which I'll link below. David Sinclair sees this as a holy grail for treating a huge number of diseases, since many diseases are caused by old age or worsened by old age. So if you just turn back the clock on those cells that are in the body, they really figure out how to heal themselves. Finally, worth mentioning, the group was able to accelerate aging, as well as bring it to a stop, as well as reverse it, as measured by DNA methylation or the epigenetic clock. Next, I want to talk about Greg Fahy, who's another researcher in the area. Greg Fahy's research group actually carried out human trials, which we'll talk about in a moment, but let's start by discussing the thymus. The thymus is an organ in your body that manufactures T cells, which form form your immune system. Actually, it's more accurate to say that the thymus educates cells. They get produced elsewhere and then sent to the thymus, which trains them to become T cells. T cells basically stands for thymus cells. It educates them by showing them positive and negative examples of what they should attack and should not attack. So a positive case is a foreign antigen, some sickness that you got hit with in the past that your body remembers. And a negative case is some other cell that's actually meant to be in your body. Don't attack that. For various reasons, the thymus starts deteriorating very quickly in humans. When you're young, it works really well, and when you get older, it stops working completely, basically. Now, T cells live for a while, so you can actually live without a thymus for quite some time. You're just not getting any new T cells being educated. For most people, all is well until around age 60, and somewhere between age 60 and 80, you lose about 98% of your ability to recognize foreign antigens. And this causes a ton of age-related inflammation. Your T cells can't distinguish between what they should attack and shouldn't attack anymore, and they just start attacking your own body, and you get arthritis and stuff like that. So Greg Fahy was very convinced that we ought to target the thymus to counteract aging. Reset the clock on the thymus, and you reset the clock on your immune system, which then starts behaving like a healthy young person's again, at least in theory. Now, we actually know how to regrow a thymus. You simply take lots of growth hormone. Problem with doing that is that you end up with sky-high insulin levels. So anyway, Greg Fahy decided to start experimenting on himself. So he started taking growth hormone and then also started taking DHEA because he had some reasonable expectation that it could reduce those insulin levels. And in proper mad scientist fashion, it all worked out. But I suppose they needed an extra boost because they also started considering metformin, which helps bring down insulin. It's an anti-diabetic drug. So we basically have three compounds going on, growth hormone and two others to reduce the insulin levels that get raised when you start taking growth hormone. And in a trial called the TRIIM trial, I assume that's how it's pronounced, TRIIM, a small number of people started taking this cocktail for about 9 months. And during that period, it actually reset their epigenetic clock by 2.5 years. So you wait 9 months and you get 2.5 years younger. At least in theory. It's not perfect. The telomere length didn't change, so that was one of the indicators of aging, but the epigenetic clocks got reset, the thymus improved, and the immune systems improved. The participants, who were all men to reduce variability, actually had some hair grow back, and people were just generally astonished by how effective this really was. Actually, it's not just the epigenetic clock. There were like 2 or 3 other measurements of cell age that all showed becoming younger. So they're trying to do a larger trial now because the original one only had a handful of people that were basically willing to trust a mad scientist. And now they're taking people of much wider age ranges, different races, and women as well, of course. And they're just still in the process of enrolling people into that study. And I guess in a year or two, we'll find out more about it. The UK has apparently indicated its interest in also running a similar study. So here's the path to immortality, at least the fully biological one. Rely on the science of epigenetics to keep taking these anti-aging treatments. For example, if every year you took an aging treatment that made you 2 years younger, then in theory you're keeping up with your own aging or even getting slightly younger as time goes on. And then you can keep taking these anti-aging treatments until even more medical advances evolve. The so-called longevity escape velocity. Once you're on that curve, you're basically sticking around to see what comes next. So various people have said that the first person to live to 150 has already been born, or the people that can live for a few more decades might reach that longevity escape velocity. And of course, the big question is when or how long. Nearly impossible to answer that question, but technology keeps evolving. David Sinclair was saying that it used to take days or weeks to perform experiments, but now they perform millions of experiments a day because they're just running simulations. And you have all this AI advancement that's happening at the same time, improving medicine in general. And as these anti-aging treatments start to become more popular, that might take the edge off of some of the more strange diseases because you're just encouraging your body to treat itself by playing piano on the epigenetics of your cells, basically. So yeah, it's really hard to predict what the future will hold. And I think it will be tied closely to the advancement of more advanced AI. But even without that advanced AI, it's probably, say, 2 decades until you can start getting onto that longevity escape velocity. Finally, in conclusion, we talked about a somewhat strange topic, which is that of longevity and potential immortality in humans. We identified a few different paths to immortality, from purely digital to becoming a cyborg, and talked about the purely biological path, which basically involves understanding epigenetics and how epigenetics measure cell age, and understanding how you can reset the epigenetic clock by basically wiping out that software and putting it back in again. There have been really interesting trials in mice where blind mice actually had their optic nerve repaired and went back to being able to see again twice, and also interesting experiments with humans, basically regenerating the thymus, allowing the person's immune system to start behaving better, and also reducing their their cell age, when measured in terms of the epigenetic clock and other methods, by more time than it took to do the treatment. So you're actually getting younger if you were to do that treatment continuously. And just as a reminder, this could have all evolved in nature, as it did for other species like sequoias. And one thing I didn't mention is there are actually 3 mechanisms in our own human body that can actually trigger this type of epigenetic clock reset. So all the building blocks are there in our genes and in our epigenome. It's just that evolution hasn't had a way or a reason to put that together into humans that live much longer than we are living now. But maybe we can put together the pieces. If you liked this video, please check out this previous video I made about how AI is transforming healthcare for the better. It's a little more down to earth than the video you just saw, I think. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a follow-up video related to this topic. All right, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.